Welcome to the Beyond Banks podcast. This is where we talk to leaders that are transforming small business funding across all of the nation with all different kinds of technology. I'm your host, Jordan Hansen, and today I'd like to introduce Cyndi Festa, a commercial data expert with decades of experience working with government registries, both domestically and internationally. You'll discover how business registry access has evolved from hours on hold to digital access that varies dramatically by jurisdiction, and then why Secretary of State offices are becoming increasingly concerned about data privacy while still meeting transparency requirements, and how to determine if the data you're accessing is truly fit for your specific use case. Hello and welcome everyone. I'm here today with Cyndi Festa, who I've gotten to know over several calls over the last few weeks. It's been a pleasure to get to know you, Cyndi. Every time you meet with Cyndi, she's got like this big smile. You can already tell she's just a very kind and incredibly intelligent person. And what really drew me to this interview and made me want to interview her is because she just has a lot of experience dealing with business data. And this is something that we're into all the time. So Cyndi, I'm just going to give you a chance to introduce yourself.
Great, thank you. So Cyndi Festa, and I've been working with data for probably quite a few decades, if you will. And I've seen quite a few changes in the marketplace with regards to data. I've worked with some very large data aggregators, and then my current role is working with a smaller organization, but still heavily involved in the data world, doing a lot of government data sourcing and things along those lines.
And again, primarily in commercial data, pretty much all in business commercial data, or have you worked also on the consumer side?
So the majority of my career has been in commercial data. I have exposure to some consumer data, but my area of expertise is absolutely on the commercial side.
And I believe now you're working at an international company that works in registries across all of the world. I think primarily our conversation will be mostly about the US, but I am interested in the difference as you see it. And so that's something that would be interesting. As you're working with both international registries and United States registries, what's the big difference there?
Yeah, so, I think the biggest difference and what I have to remind people constantly is the actual span of responsibility for many of ours, and we spoke about this, the Secretary of State or the registry in the US, as opposed to maybe some of these registries outside the US. Some of these registries, their sole responsibility or that's responsible for these commercial registries, that could be their sole responsibility. Whereas in the US, a lot of times their time is spent between business services, elections, and things along those lines. And it really is, so you start there and then you move down as far as the way they're funded and the way they're developed and the views on the overall data privacy. There's significant differences around the globe when it comes to those types of areas, privacy, availability of data, etc. But yes, let's try to keep this to the US, because if we try to include all of it at once, it becomes quite cumbersome for anyone trying to follow.
Yeah. And as you've worked with this data through decades, like you said, how have you seen it change, both from like a privacy standpoint and availability, like fields? Are there different things available that weren't available originally? Is it more private or less private now? And what direction do you think it'll go?
So it's interesting that you ask, because I think it has changed as far as the availability. But what's really interesting to me is the actual general population understanding the need for this data and where to get this data. So I remember a time when I would be working to gather information and I'd have to validate or confirm that an entity was registered, because that's really what you're trying to do is I see a company name, I do want to make sure it's registered, because that adds a level of validity to it. And I remember sitting on hold, and we would listen to what we call at that point in time, and this probably will date me, but elevator music. And, that would be an afternoon, you'd sit on hold and you'd just call and you'd say, okay, I need to check this status, this chat, this status, this status. You were actually speaking to a human and you were actually having a conversation. So I guess, I'll start with, when's the last time that happened, right?
Yeah. So do you think they were looking looking in like their books, like they're looking at files is what they were doing. They were looking through their filing cabinets and checking.
Absolutely. And they were looking at things called microfiche and microfilm and actually pulling this data and looking at it. So that's what was happening there. Now, yes, we can all say, oh, those were the days, and you could actually just do that. But over time, then this data became made available for searching, and it was available on the web, and you could begin to search and things like that. But don't kid yourself. Not everybody or not every jurisdiction came forward with that information at the same time. It took years till this data became available. And one of the things that I remember saying repeatedly to, my peers at various organizations was the data is made available publicly. That's the requirement. They didn't say it had to be easy to get to it.
Yeah.
And that's the key there. Meeting the requirement or the regulation could be one thing. Making it ease or ease of use can be a completely different conversation.
Yeah, that's definitely what we see as well.
Yeah.
Sometimes, and that is a huge variance from state to state.
Exactly. And that goes to the fact that each jurisdiction has their own budgets. They can actually do their own bidding. They can go out for RFPs. They can do in-house software design, or they can leverage a third-party provider. And so that's probably why when you see some of these jurisdictions, you may see a bit of consistency, probably like the 80-20 rule. 80% of it looks the same. There may be some uniqueness, but it's because they're using consistent third-party providers there. And that's what you're seeing with a lot of these. And then you may have another jurisdiction who decides that I'm going to build it in-house, and they can do that as well.
Do you see it? As we consume this data, we're getting this data all the time. Like you said, sometimes it's really a pain to get. Sometimes it's very easy to get. How much do you think is the Secretary of State, both the person and the office? How much is it them just not wanting to reveal the data, trying to be more private with the data? And how much is it just purely like priority and budget? Like, I'm going to get this minimum. I don't really care. Hey, I really want to guard this information.
So first and foremost, I have yet to run across a Secretary of State or an elected official who says, I don't want to share the data. I think what they're trying to do is also balance the availability of data and making sure that they're protecting the businesses that have registered with them. There is quite a bit of fraud in the marketplace. And sometimes what happens is when we're trying to protect or we approach something to protect, we actually might create other barriers for individuals that are trying to do good. So one of the things that I've often said is you've got a requirement or a regulation that says I need to leverage the data as it was filed at the filing office, right? And then you have a filing office concerned about nefarious activities, concerned about foreign IPs coming in, concerned about this data and whatnot, and trying to find the right balance, I think, is where it becomes difficult. For these filing officers, a lot of what they have to be careful about is that they protect those businesses, because we always think about businesses as these big guys, but what about the small shop? What about the small organization that there could be corporate identity theft, or there could be an entity that goes into a lapsed status and it's taken over by someone else. We've all seen those stories, and it's happening. So they're custodians of this data, and they've got to find the right balance.
I see. So what you're saying is they are more than happy to let the information be public and be used for like the purpose we have, which is due diligence. But at the same time, when you're revealing individuals' names, it also exposes it to someone, like you said, fraud. Someone can kind of pretend to be that company because they have all the information there. They know the registry agent, the officer in there. They can say, hey, I'm Frank, and living at whatever address because they looked it up. Correct. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. And it's a tough game. You've got to find the right balance. And, it's not easy for any organization to figure that out. And, you almost have to serve two use cases there.
Yeah. And as time goes on, what direction do you see it going? I see a lot of the larger states, they are making it more like New York, Texas, Florida. They have this very available. Like Florida, for example, has tons of information available. And it seems like the bigger ones almost make that easier. Maybe it's just because more taxpayers are putting pressure on to get this data. I don't know. But what direction do you see it going? How's that?
I do see the jurisdictions continuing. Well, first of all, so I know that the jurisdictions are actively actively having conversations around fraud, okay? And actively looking and exploring opportunities to find ways to thwart that. I also know that, to your point, some jurisdictions have data which is more readily available. One of the things that I do encourage people to pay attention to is when that data is available, and a lot of times it's in an open data, initiative and things along those lines, is it still fit for purpose? So is it a source that's updated weekly, fit for purpose for due diligence? I can't answer that, but I do think being able to clearly articulate that this is updated on a weekly basis versus this is updated on an hourly basis or on demand, those are two different things. So I think that the general consumer needs to be cognizant of some of these nuances. So that's number one. I do see the data continue to be opened up because I do think that transparency, it's more important over time, and our regulations are saying that we need this transparency. But what does that mean? Is it all of the attributes? Is it some of the attributes? Is it key attributes? And who decides what are the key attributes? I think you need to be careful with the question or the answer, if you will, because just because it's opening up more doesn't mean it's all opening up.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Anytime it gets into, we have some listings on our website of businesses, some of the stuff we have in our database, and we regularly get emails from people that say, hey, I don't want my personal information visible. And we redact it and take it away, even though it's already public on the, we're getting the data from the Secretary of State. But it's like you said, like people are concerned when it's their personal, individual information they have on there.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is some of the data that was presented 10, 15 years ago has since been redacted. But that doesn't mean that the record holders, so maybe someone that actually got a copy of that or consumed it, that they adhered to the redaction policies as well. So there could be a document out there that today when you look at it on the government site is redacted. But if you have an older pre-redacted version, you may actually see that data that you're not supposed to see. So it is really, it's a tricky space, and privacy concerns are more and more prevalent as we change, I guess, overall from society perspective.
Yeah. So Cyndi, as you were, I know you have customers that are, you're helping access this data and helping them with their due diligence, helping them also with their registry. I think it currently encompasses helping companies do their registrations with these states. But what would you advise a company that's using this data for like due diligence? Like, what would you say, hey, as you're coming into this is what you should know, and this is what you should keep in mind?
So I guess there's a couple of things. So yes, we help large regulated entities, generally financial institutions, adhere to the regulations that are set forth from a KYC due diligence perspective. And what I tell my clients constantly, and we hit upon this at the very beginning, each jurisdiction is unique, okay? While the data in jurisdiction A may mean one thing, that same data may not, or those attributes may not be available in jurisdiction B. And as such, if you set out an expectation that every jurisdiction will have a list of attributes, you're going to set yourself up for disappointment because that's not the way it works. The other thing that I would say is pay attention to, you mentioned earlier, large states and taxpayer bases and things along those lines. But there's other things that feed into that. And understanding laws of the particular states, and sometimes it's how friendly a court is to different types of business. Sometimes it's incentives for businesses to register in a jurisdiction, things along those lines. All of those things play a part in actually where businesses are registering. Now, I'm not saying the economy and things along those lines, because you can absolutely register in jurisdiction A and then as a foreign registration in jurisdiction B and have your operations in jurisdiction B, and you have reporting requirements to the domestic registration. But the point being that there are things that are happening. So a lot of times people will say to me, why would there be so many registrations of about this type of business in jurisdiction A? And I'll say, because the laws in jurisdiction A support those types of businesses. What I try to tell people is there's many decisions that are taken that actually influence the decision as to where to register and how businesses operate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and totally understand. We all know what that jurisdiction A is you're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It's a very business-friendly jurisdiction in the United States that a lot of the companies are there.
Yes.
Well, I really appreciate your time, Cyndi. As we've gone through this conversation, you've already given us a lot of information. I feel like it went so fast. Is there anything else that you feel like really is important that needs to be shared when it comes to this business information before we end?
I think the one thing that I'm going to leave you with, and hopefully your listeners, is there's lots of sayings that say, the value of data, etc. But I just want to be clear, not all data fits every use case. I encourage people to think about what they want to do with the data. Are you using it for marketing purposes? Are you using it for compliance purposes? Are you using it for risk? What are you using the data for? And then determine what is the best source for the data.
Yeah, we get a lot of people reaching out to us for marketing purposes for Secretary of State data. And most of the time I'm like, it's probably not the best. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, and that's exactly my point. Because, you could send that to ABC LLC, which is really John's Pizza Shop. You know what I mean? Doing business as. And ABC LLC means nothing.
Exactly that. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your time, Cyndi. This has been really great. Maybe this is a conversation we need to have again. Every time I talk with you, I always think, she just knows so much. And I'm going to keep asking a lot of those questions because you have that huge wealth of knowledge.
No problem. Happy to help.